During my first year of being a fireman, it was quite often the case to be booked to go on loan to other depots if they were short-staffed. Feltham and Nine Elms were normally the two depots that were always short, but I did go to Reading and Redhill Motive Power Depot and also Fratton Motive Power Depot on occasions. Nine Elms, 70A. Most of the work was of the preparation and disposal, P&D variety, although quite a number of the turns involved working empty coaching stock from Waterloo to Clapham and vice versa. Clapham Junction Yard was an extremely busy place in the 1960s, as nearly all the steam-hauled main line trains were serviced there. The locomotives that performed the majority of this work were usually ex-GWR 5700 class pannier tanks, which were extremely strong, having no problem in hauling a 12-14 coach set. I didn't particularly like the cab layout, as the driver and fireman's positions weren't on the same level as the floor, which you fired from, and they were also right-handed, which I didn't enjoy. It wasn't until some time later, when I was ordered by my driver, Ray Reid, to stay over my own side of the footplate on an N-class for a week, that I was able to learn how to be ambidextrous in using the firing shovel. However, sometimes he'd be booked an M7 class, a motor tank, although later on both types of these locomotives were phased out and replaced by BR Standard Class 3MT and IVEC Class 2MT locomotives. The usual running of the turn would go something like this. Relieve the incoming service from Clapham and uncouple the locomotive from the train. Take water at the column provided at the concourse end of the station. Once the starting signal had cleared and the guard had waved his green flag, your locomotive would assist the train out of Waterloo as a banking engine until you nearly reached the starting signal. Once the train had cleared Waterloo Bridge and the shunting signal had cleared, you would then move towards Waterloo Bridge over the ground signal. When the ground signal cleared, you would then proceed back into the dock alongside platform 11 to await your next service, or alternatively couple onto another set of empty coaching stock of the service that had just arrived. Once coupled and the signal had cleared, you would then work the train to Clapham Yard, running through the carriage washing machine on the way. As you approach Clapham Yard, you would pick up the shunter on the crossing by the yard foreman's cabin before drawing down to the end of the yard, stopping clear of the run-round road. The shunter would then uncouple the train, and once the locomotive moved over the points of the run-round road, he would hold the spring points over so you could then proceed up to the top end of the yard. You would then set back onto the next set of empty coaching stock, and then wait until the starting time, and once the yard foreman had given you the signal by waving a green flag, this would be your authorisation to proceed towards Waterloo. The process would then repeat itself several times during the day before being relieved by another crew. The preparation and disposal turns at Nine Elms were probably the most physically demanding, and this work consisted of cleaning fires and emptying smoke boxes on several locomotives plus preparation duties. Invariably, the drivers that were booked with me were young past firemen or drivers that would readily lend a hand. The fireboxes on Merchant Navy, West Country and Battle of Britain class locomotives were huge, and as mentioned in my previous chapter, it was the order of the day to knob them up, so that when the coal burnt through, the fire was rolling out the firehole door. As a 16-year-old fireman, I wasn't exactly a strongly built lad and found the work extremely tiring, and once after working a 12-hour shift, I was so tired I fell asleep standing up in the corridor of Portsmouth Express train on my way back home to Guildford. Once, whilst working a P&D duty at Nine Elms, I was preparing a Lord Nelson class locomotive my driver said to me that I might have to go the turn, as the fireman of the duty had dropped it. This was a slang term used at the time that meant that the person hadn't or wasn't going to sign on duty in time. The turn of duty involved working a summer relief train to Brockenhurst, and at the time I'd never even heard of the place. As it turned out, the fireman made it in time, so unfortunately I had to continue with my P&D duties. Sometimes the duties involved the transfer of freshly prepared locomotives to Waterloo and return with another locomotive for disposal. The next photo shows Loco Junction signal box, and on the right, 2 locomotives exiting Nine Elms depot. Also, a boat train from Waterloo to Southampton docks approaches on the down-through line. In this aerial scene, long before drone photography was invented, John Scracers captured Waterloo Station in its steam heyday. In the foreground, original Battle of Britain Class 34057 Biggin Hill crosses Waterloo Bridge with a semi-fast passenger service for Salisbury. It used to really worry me as we headed tender first to Waterloo that I would read the signals wrongly on the gantries between Loco Junction signal box and Waterloo. Some of the signals were blind to the driver of a left-handed locomotive, and I didn't have a clue at first which one corresponded to the line we were on. It was also the fireman's duties to couple and uncouple a locomotive to and from the train at Waterloo, and sometimes there would be 2 locomotives running up to Waterloo, and they would be uncoupled on the main line at the home signal. They would then be dispatched separately to their correct train. In order for the signalman at Waterloo to establish which locomotive went on to its correct train, white disc boards or white headlights would be displayed on the tenders of each locomotive as it travelled to Waterloo. Some of the head codes used are as follows. Middle left of the smoke box, Basingstoke. Middle left and bottom right corner, Bournemouth. Top and bottom middle, Salisbury. Top and bottom right, Southampton New Docks. Top and bottom left, Southampton Old Docks. This photograph shows Lord Nelson Class 30862 Lord Collingwood about to head the 10:54 a.m. semi-fast service to Basingstoke at Waterloo Platform 8 on the 28th of October 1961. The fireman has just coupled the locomotive to the train and is about to affix the head code disc and remove the tail lamp. And this photograph shows rebuilt West Country Class 34097 Holsworthy and rebuilt Merchant Navy Class 35028 Clanline at the buffer stops at Waterloo, awaiting the release of their respective trains. In this shot, BR Standard Class 4MT 80089 awaits departure from Waterloo with some empty coaching stock, as a wheel tapper checks for anything amiss. An atmospheric scene of rebuilt West Country Class 34040 Crewe Kern and original West Country Class 34102 Lapford in the shed at Nine Elms. A splendid view of activity at Nine Elms Motive Power Depot from the block of flats that lay behind the complex. A fireman rides on the steps of BR Standard Class 4MT 00143 after altering their points. The crew of rebuilt West Country Class 34108 Wincanton, minus their nameplates, have just taken water in preparation for departure to Waterloo for an express to Salisbury. In the background, a host of goods wagons and a maze of lines lead to Nine Elms Upyard, which was accessed by travelling under the main line viaduct through the arches. Another splendid view of Nine Elms Depot, with the coaling plant on the right of the photograph and Battersea Power Station in the background. Although this incident didn't take place until my 18th birthday, I thought I'd add it to this on loan chapter. I booked on at Guildford to go past the Nine Elms and prepare a Q1 class to run light engine to Mitcham Junction and work a ballast train down the new line. On arrival at Nine Elms, I was met by my driver and we set about our preparation duties. The locomotive was in a right state, not having much steam or water in the boiler. However, we managed to move her out of the shed and onto the exit road, and I climbed onto the tender to take water. The tender was nearly empty, so my driver decided that whilst the tender was filling, we would take on some liquid refreshment ourselves at the Brook, a public house situated just outside Nine Elms Depot in Brooklands Passage. I'd never seen anyone drink a pint like he did, as he was able to tip a pint of glass beer down his throat without gulping. He was ready for his next pint before I'd even sipped the head off mine. By the time I'd finished my pint, it was time to get back, and when we returned, the water was gushing out of the tender and overflowing everywhere. I managed to rouse the fire into life, but we didn't have enough steam to release the vacuum brake, and as it was time to leave the depot, my driver leaked the brakes off, and we left with 60 pounds of steam in the boiler with only a tender brake to stop with. However, once we cleared Clapham Junction, running light to Wimbledon, I managed to build up some steam pressure in the boiler, which enabled my driver to create the vacuum brake. On arrival at Mitcham Yard, we coupled up to our train, and as we had some time to kill before our departure, my driver decided it was necessary for us to take some more liquid refreshment at a nearby working men's club. Here again he performed his usual trick in drinking several pints of beer, each one without gulping, which was quite incredible. I've never seen anyone else drink beer like he could to this day. Feltham, 70B. Feltham was an awful place to get to from Guildford, as firstly you'd have to catch a stopping train to Weybridge. Incidentally, there were 6 consecutive stations that started with a W from Guildford going towards London: Worplesdon, Woking, West Byfleet, West Weybridge, as it was called then, Weybridge, and finally Walton. At Weybridge, you'd have to catch another train to Feltham that departed from the Up Bay platform at Weybridge, which was another 7 stops, and then you had to walk from the station along the complete length of a huge railway yard to the depot, which was situated quite near to Hounslow Junction. Some of the motive power staff at Feltham kept their bikes at Feltham station, especially for the journey. The time allowed to walk from the station to the depot was 20 minutes, and it invariably rained, and you arrived soaking wet. The jobs that I'd normally get were to assist the shed shunt driver in coaling and watering the locomotives, and finally stabling them in the shed for their next turn of duty. There were quite a number of withdrawn W-class locomotives stored at Feltham Motive Power Depot, and I can remember hauling several of them coupled together from one road to another, the awful sound of pistons and rods groaning because of the lack of lubrication. All of these locomotives were destined for the scrap heap. A couple of times I had a firing turn to Brent, which was a place I'd never been to before. This was working a freight train, returning with another freight train to Feltham, after we'd turned the locomotive around in a complete loop which went under the London Midland main line. It was a fascinating journey running via Brentford and Acton over the top of the Western Region main line, and the driver informed me that when it was foggy you could still know where you were going by the sounds of the bridges and smells emitted from the factories, bakeries, etc. Obviously an early version of GPS that TomTom could have utilised. Another Feltham turn that I used to get quite regularly was to go past to Teddington and relieve a fireman there. Invariably the driver was Ron Mills, and we got on very well. The locomotive was always a Q1 class, a locomotive that I was quite familiar with, as we had several of this class based at Guildford. We would call in at all the station yards of Kingston, then Hampton, Sunbury, and then back to Twickenham, picking up wagons here, dropping wagons off there, before continuing our journey back to Feltham Yard. After uncoupling from the train, the locomotive ran light to Feltham Depot, and disposal duties were then performed. You then had to walk back to Feltham Station from the depot and make the long train journey back home via Weybridge, always having to wait ages for a connecting service back to Guildford. All of these on-loan turns invariably meant working long hours, whether it was Feltham or Nine Elms, but at least you were also paid for the journey times of 2 hours either way. Reading Southern, 70C. I only went on loan to Reading a couple of times, and both duties involved working loose coupled freight trains to Didcot and return. It was the first time I'd ever worked on the Great Western Railway, and although we had a Southern Region locomotive, a U-class, it still felt great as we went through Reading General Station, a place where I'd spent hundreds of hours train spotting. On the return trip from Didcot to Reading, we would be diverted into a long relief road at Sonning Cutting, running up to the back of another train which was already standing there. This took me by surprise, as it was the first time that I'd ever experienced the permissive working principle where 2 trains could be in one section at one time. Fratton, 71D. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to get a chance to be a fireman on the Puffing Billy line, as other Guildford men had done before me when sent on loan to Fratton. The line went from Havant to Hayling Island and was normally headed by an A1X class locomotive. My parents quite often took us kids to Hayling Island for our summer holiday, and we'd often have a trip over the line. My earliest recollection of seeing and hearing a steam locomotive was at Havant, when I was in my infancy. A fast passenger train came through the station at speed, and it frightened the life out of me. Anyway, any Hayling Island branch work wasn't to be, and instead I was booked to turn performing preparation duties with a BR Standard Class 4MT locomotive, and then working a passenger train from Portsmouth to Salisbury, getting relief by a pair of Salisbury men at Fareham. My driver and I would then make our way back to Fratton, and then I returned back passenger to Guildford. Redhill, 75B. I only went on loan to Redhill once, and that was to work a freight to Reading in return. I'd only been firing a few months, so I didn't really know what I was doing. I can recall that the freight trip we worked to Reading was quite arduous, especially the climb up the steep bank from Dorking to Welcome Bridge. The driver I was booked with wasn't the happiest of men finding out he had a rookie fireman, and didn't give me any instruction or encouragement, but instead did most of the firing himself and just let me work the injectors. I suppose that I did learn quite a lot from watching him, but felt a bit awkward in just being there to make up the numbers. This is a wonderful view of Redhill Motive Power Depot in 1962, and an assortment of locomotives are on shed. A 350 horsepower diesel shunter, D3224, N-Class 31854, a U1 and other U-Class locomotives lounge in the back roads. In the middle road, S15 Class 30842, V Schools Class 30911 Dover and N Class 31817 also await their next turns of duty. This is a poem by A.R. Lofty Dollery from Fratton, 71D. The engine shed was a dark smoky place, where locomotives rested their power and grace, where men worked hard and were proud and contented in the most marvellous job that was ever invented. Drivers from Surrey, Hants, Sussex and Kent, firemen too, signed on and went, off on their duty, running a train. Passenger, goods, branch line and main. Drivers whose pride wouldn't let them run late, with stoppers, expresses, boat trains and freight, and whose skills with their terrain were so finely reckoned that they timed its progress almost to the second. The fireman toiled at the variety of work, most involved sweating amidst dust and dirt, and one of the things that he quickly learnt is partly depended on what coal was burnt. Yorkshire hard, burnt fast and hot, left thin hard clinker but not a lot. Tilmanston from Kent was very unclean, left a box full of ash and not much steam. Good Welsh burnt slow but very bright, needed careful firing but steamed all right. Briquettes were not liked, for it must be said, the dust from them left your eyes sore and red. The classes of engines all had a nickname. There were Arthurs and Nelsons of historical fame, greyhounds, paddle boats, Montgolypers too, schools and hoppers and even a queue. There were packets, West Countries and Wainwrights, D's, Bulldogs and Charlies or just plain C's, Black Motors, Terriers, Drummonds M7s, Chonkers, 8s and L11. And who were the men who worked with steam, who loved their toil and were skilful and keen? Bradbury, Len Softly, Harry Mintram and Elliot, Ginger Atkins, Benoin and Shedmaster Everett, Whispering Charlie, Jumbo Collins, Shiner Wright, Fred Hand, Dan Power and Lillywhite, General Booth, Ten Daish and Billy Biles, George Mills, Bill Williams and Lofty Miles. Shed foreman Bert Oliver checked rest room and then round to the canteen to find standby men. Glowering at crews with a few hours to spare, snaps, there's one to square up and two to prepare. The list is endless, I can see them yet. What characters they were, I shall never forget. And when I think back, as men often do, the best part of all, I was one of them too. Even after all these years, evocative sounds still come back to my ears. The clang of the shovel on the fire doors ring. The buzz of the safety valves, injectors sing. A West Country's whistle wailing a mournful song. The shrill scream of a schools as we thunder along. The bark of an exhaust then connecting rods clank as we shut off steam and coast down the bank. The suck of ejector with vacuum to create. The inrush of air as we put on the brake. Wheel flanges squealing on the check rails bend as we enter the depot at duty's end. Take coal and water, then onto the table, there to be turned then onto her stable. A cry of ease up sounds into the air. She's coming on balance, steady, she's there. Then on to the pit road the ashpan is raked and the fire bars cleaned of the clinkers they're caked. Shedman asking, a favour mate, put her in the middle road, she's not out till late. Slowly she moves to join in the queue. Driver and fireman have a bit left to do. Take out the trimmings, put her away, screw her down, it's the end of her day. Tools in the locker, put out the lights, clean up the floor with brush and pet pipe. Last check of the boiler, water's okay, pick up the tea cans, sign off and away. It broke my heart to say goodbye, but I shall remember until I die. The smell, the smoke, the living steam. Did it really happen, or was it a dream?